All right. Let's get to this one. You have heard it was said that anxiety is a sin. But I say, nah, I'm just kidding. I'm obviously not the Lord, right? All right. Back in April of this year, early 8 months ago, Strack and I on Cross Examine did an episode called Anxiety, Sinful or Not. So you can check that out. That was a great conversation that we had. And so I'll put a link in the description of this show if you want to check out that podcast. All right. Now, I have been told for the majority of my Christian life that anxiety was a sin. And I believe that to be so. It's an expression of not trusting the Lord and so forth and all of that. So anxiety is definitely an issue. The Bible definitely says do not be anxious and things like that. So I've been told for most of my Christian life that categorically anxiety is a sin. All right. And anxiety, if we're being honest, if we're really assessing our culture, anxiety is the real pandemic. You know, I did a study recently where from 2010 to 2020, drugs for anxiety were went like, I think 200 million. I think it was $2 billion, right, for drugs for anxiety. But anxiety increased 400% from 2010 to 2020. And I can give you the book. I forgot what it's called. It's somewhere around here. But it's basically saying that the drugs for anxiety are not curing anxiety, right? So it's actually increasing it. So although we have the most medication we've ever had to cure anxiety, people are increasingly more and more anxious. I have my people in my family struggle with anxiety in ways that I don't always understand. And so as I've done a lot of study on this issue, I realized a crazy thought. And I looked at this closely. I realized a crazy thought because I've always thought anxiety was sin. And then one day in reading and studying, I realized Jesus was anxious. Jesus had some anxiety. All right. So let's jump into that. Let's talk about that. And then let me say a couple thoughts about just anxiety. All right. Because anxiety can be sin, definitely, but it's not always sin. And let me tell you why. Because one, Jesus had anxiety. Then we'll look at Paul and so forth. All right. So Jesus had anxiety. Let's start with the book of Matthew. So this is in the Garden of Gethsemane. We all know this story. If you're not of the Christian tradition, essentially Jesus was going with his disciples. It was right before the crucifixion. He was going to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was really struggling with the fact that he was about to die. And we're going to look at each of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and just see what it said. All right. So here's what it says in Matthew, right? Matthew 12 or 26, beginning in verse 36. Here's what it says. So then Jesus went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then verse 38 says this. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." All right, so here's Jesus explaining to his disciples. It's using this word sorrowful, okay? Now, here's one thing you have to understand for those of us who are of the Christian tradition. The Greek language is very complex, kind of like English languages. Like, we can say the same word can sound the same, but it's actually different depending on the context, right? So let's just take, for example, the word there. If you ask me, where are they? And I say, over there, that's a different kind of there, even though it sounds like there. If I say, it's theirs, then that's a different there, all right? And if I say, they're up there, then that's a different kind of there, right? So Greek is very similar. There can be multiple definitions, and sometimes we use one word to try to translate a Greek phrase, right? So it's not always a great translation. So this word sorrowful is used to describe Jesus's perspective and how he felt talking to his disciples in Matthew. But here's what sorrowful means in the actual Greek. So the Greek word for sorrowful is lepeo, right? To us, it would be Lypeo. Lepeo is the Greek word for Sorrowful. So Jesus is saying, I'm sorrowful. All right. Here's the Greek definition of sorrowful. It means to cause severe or mental emotional distress, to be vexed, to irritate, offend, or insult. So in context, you have to figure out. So it's severe or mental emotional distress. All right. That's one. Then you look up, well, what is the word? Don't you hate when words kind of give you other words that you got to look up? So let's look up the word distress. Here's what distress means: suffering from extreme anxiety, sorrow, or pain. Okay. So again, another word within the word. So here's this word, lepeo, to grieve or to be distressed, right? It means to be sorrowful, distressed, to be extremely anxious. So here Jesus is saying to his disciples, I'm essentially really anxious right now because I know I have to face the crucifixion. Now, many people, if you think anxiety is a sin, you're going to be offended at this statement and think I'm somehow a heretic. I would tell you, do your homework on the languages. I think this idea, and again, if the presupposition that anxiety is a sin, then you can't, you got a lot of problems in, and we're going to look at it in just a second. All right, let's go to the Mark translation. All right, here's Mark, same scene, but the words are a little bit different. Here's what it says. Then they came to a place called, I'm not going to put this on the screen, called Gethsemane. He told his disciples, sit here while I pray. This is Mark 14, verse 33 now. He took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. Okay? So we looked at this distress as a different word, but this word troubled, the word troubled is ademonein. It's Ademonein. Okay? That's what it means. Ademonein is the Greek word for troubled. Here's what it means, the definition in the Greek, in the BDAG, LSG, and the Louw-Nida. These are all Greek definitions, Greek dictionaries. Here's what it means. Be in anxiety, be distressed, troubled. That's the BDAG. The LSG means to be sorely troubled, dismayed, be in anguish, to be puzzled. And here's the Louw-Nida. To be troubled, to be upset, to be distressed. All right? So these Greek definitions are describing Jesus as anxious, in anguish, and all these things, okay? If you look up the word anguish, you know what anguish means? To be in deep anxiety. All right. Let's look at this one more time. In Luke, here's what Luke says. Here's what Luke says. Same scene. Here's what Luke says. Beginning in verse 44 or 43. Then this is after, okay, wait a minute, let me back up. So in Luke, an angel comes to encourage the Lord. Like he's praying, an angel comes to strengthen him, and we get the scene where his sweat becomes drops of blood, right? Here's what it says. Verse 43 of Luke 22. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And in verse 44, it says this. Being in anguish, he prayed more fervently. Okay? Here's the word for anguish. Agonia, right? Being in agony, right? Agony. It means distress. Distress means anxiety. It means anguish. It means to struggle for victory. Intense anguish or sorrow, right? So this word, anguish and agony are just a mix of anxiety and frustration. We used to like, I'm experiencing angst, right? That's a mix of anxiety and frustration. So Jesus had, at least in this scene, a moment of anxiety. And the anxiety was so intense that Jesus said, I feel like, so he said to Peter, James, and John, I feel like I'm going to die. I feel like I'm going to die. This is how intense this sorrow that I'm feeling in my soul is. I feel like I'm going to die. This was anxiety. Now, keep in mind this, that Jesus said, I always do what pleases the Father. Right? Keep that in mind, that Jesus said, I only do what I see the Father doing, or what pleases the Father. So in this scene where Jesus is experiencing sorrow, anguish, distress, troubled, which are all just sort of synonyms or different ways of describing anxiety, Jesus is doing what the Father, only what pleases the Father. So in this scene, the Father is okay with Jesus experiencing this particular emotion, this particular feeling, because we know that Jesus didn't sin. At least I believe that in my Christian tradition, that Jesus was sinless. I can't speak for you. I believe that Jesus was sinless. And so this expression of anguish, sorrow, these things, we have to take, well, what does this mean then? What does it mean? All right, now let's look at something a little bit different, because Paul, there's other verses that describe, why I think anxiety isn't necessarily always sinful, okay? So here's Paul in 2 Corinthians 11, right? Paul's writing, he's talking about this, right? And Paul, he describes this in 2 Corinthians 11. Here's what he says. He gives a whole list of things that he's experienced, like persecutions, beaten, shipwrecked, all these things, right? He's giving a whole list of things that prove that he's an apostle of Christ and not an imposter like the other people are accusing him of. And here's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11:28. He says, and apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches, right? So is Paul saying that his concern for the churches is sinful? Is Paul confessing sin here? I don't think that's what Paul's doing. Paul's acknowledging that he's concerned for the churches that he's planted because he understands that they're going to be experiencing persecution. They are up against a lot that's going on right now. They can be killed for their faith, and Paul understands that, right? So there are cases where, and I'll say this too, the Bible does not really describe anxiety in the same way it does other sins. Okay? It doesn't really. So we got the do not be anxious, those commands, and we could say, well, but does every do not command a sin? No, not necessarily, right? And there's other ways that the Bible describes anxiety that doesn't seem to resonate with it being sinful. Here's one in Proverbs, right? Proverbs 12:25. Anxiety makes a man's heart weigh him down, but a good word makes him glad, right? So it doesn't talk about anxiety like it's this sinful disposition that a person has, okay? It talks about it like this is really a thing that people go through, but a good word would make them glad, right? You get something, and so there's a lot I'm trying not to say because I want to kind of build up, but I'll say this. When the Bible talks about like anxiety, there are times it can be sinful, right? So here's a reality. Anxiety can be sinful, but it's not always sin, right? It can be sinful, but it's not always sin. And the way we have to understand that is we have to understand that anxiety is very much a spectrum. There is a spectrum of anxiety, and it could determine if it's sinful or not. So when Paul talks about, so you got this one area, right? You have this spectrum of anxiety where there's loving concern, okay? You can have loving concern. Prime example, you have a child. You go to the doctor, right? You find out your child is very sick, and you start to get anxious about if they may die or not. That doesn't mean you're sinning against God and don't trust the Lord, but you have a loving concern for your child, right? It's a spectrum. Anxiety is a spectrum. So you have this loving concern. You can care about people and worry about their well-being, but not necessarily saying you don't trust the Lord. You just genuinely have a loving concern for this person or people and what may happen to them. This is what Paul is saying when he talks about his anxiety for the churches. But then there can be anxiety where you're reacting to the possibility of suffering or wanting to avoid suffering, right? This is what Jesus did in the garden. He says, Father, take this cup from me. Think about this for a moment. Jesus knew, remember in Luke 3 when he told his mother and father, when they were looking for him, he said, why are you looking for me? I'm in my Father's house. Like Jesus knew from the ground up, right, that he was going to be crucified, that he was going to die, that he was connected to the Father in a unique way. He knew from the ground up. And then Jesus knows that I need to die so that people can be saved. In John 12, he says this, now the ruler of this world will be cast out, and when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. And then John says in a parenthetical statement, right after that, he was talking about the way he was going to die. So Jesus understood when I'm crucified, I'm going to draw all men to myself. So why then does he ask the Father to take the cup away, to take being crucified away from him, when he knows that that's what he signed up for, and that's the only way salvation can happen? And he gets anxious because the possibility of experiencing the full wrath of God and wanting to avoid it is a human nature. And Jesus was fully human. He wasn't sinning. You know, in another passage in Philippians 2:4, 2-7, Paul is talking to these two prominent women leaders in the church, Euodia and Syntyche. And he says this is a popular passage. He says this, I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women. So he's talking to the pastor of the Philippian church. Help these two women. These are soldiers. These women are strong women in the church. He says, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. So he's saying these are solid women. They're in an argument. It's affecting the church. And he's saying, brother, help these women agree in the Lord. And then he says this to them. This is Philippians 4, beginning of verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. He's talking to these women. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything in prayer and supplication, make your requests known to the Lord. So so there are times when, okay, anxiety is not the place we're supposed to be, but it is a part of the human experience. And even Jesus himself did so. A couple other examples where anxiety isn't sinful. Here's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, talking about marriage. He says this, I want you to be free from anxieties, right? But then he says, the unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But so listen to how he's using the word anxious and anxiety. He's using it like, look, this person is anxious. There's a desire to want to know how to please the Lord, right? He's saying they're anxious about that. When he said, I want you to be free from anxieties, he was talking about the anxiety that comes with being married. It'll distract you because he says, look, the married woman is anxious about worldly things. But when he talks about being anxious about godly things when they're single, he's not correcting that premise. He's not correcting them for being anxious. He's saying, hey, there's a spectrum of anxiety. There's a spectrum of anxiety. It can be sinful, but it's not always sinful. Let me give you one more verse to make this point, and then we'll say two more things and we're out of here. Here's another verse that I think is a crazy verse when you think about what God is saying to all of us in this verse, right? Here's what he says in 1 Peter 5. Think about this for a second. Here's what he says. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. Verse 7, listen to this. Casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Okay, let me ask you a question and you think about this. What other sin issue does God say, cast on me because I care for you? Think about that for a second. So if anxiety is always sin, God is saying here, he doesn't say cast your sexual immorality, cast your gossip, your bitterness, all that. He's saying, no, get rid of those things, put those things away. But on this one, he's saying, look, cast your anxieties on me because I care for you. So anxiety is a way that we can, it's an invitation to humble ourselves and to give God those burdens, right? There are genuine, general burdens that people have. It's not always sinful, but it can be sinful. You can use it as a weapon. Now let's talk about when can anxiety be sinful? Well, in Matthew 6, this is the main passage where people they think it's sinful. But if you actually look at Matthew chapter 6, it starts off with like giving to the needy and then praying and then fasting. And then there's something else and then not being anxious, right? You know, setting your mind on things above and then not being anxious. It's not listed. In fact, you will not find, that I'm aware of, I could be wrong in this, but I don't think I am. You will not find anxiety in the list of sins for the reason the wrath of God is coming. You won't find it there. Because I don't think it's always sinful. I think it's a natural expression of being human. For God knows that we are frail. He knows we're dust. He knows that we are concerned with these things. So here's when anxiety can be sinful. One, when it causes conflict, like Euodia and Syntyche. You're anxious about these things. And then so he says, so when there's a lack of prayer, so Paul says, remember in Philippians 4, Paul says, do not be anxious about anything, right? But with prayer and supplication, make your requests known to God, right? So when anxiety leads to a lack of prayer, right? You're not making requests known to God. You're essentially, like First Peter is saying here, you're not humbling yourself, casting your anxiety. It's almost they're saying the same thing differently. Paul says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything with prayer and supplication, make your requests known to God, right? So you're anxious, so you can be anxious and make your request known to God. And that's how you cast your anxieties on the Lord because he cares for you. This is the dynamic that Paul and Peter are getting at. So you can be sinful where you refuse to cast it on God and you sit down and worry about it. You sit down and think about how you can fix it and how you can do it and what you want. And sometimes you just have to say, you know what, Lord, I'm not sovereign. I'm not you. I can't fix this. I need to go to you. This is what Jesus did. This is Jesus. God himself said, man, I need to pray to the Father. Even though I'm God and I can do all these things, I'm going to pray to the Father, right? So that's a way. And what did Jesus do? He humbled himself. This is where Paul and Peter are getting this from. Humble yourself. Jesus in the garden was casting his anxieties on the Lord because he cares for him. And then the Lord sent an angel and he was still anxious, right? So this is the reality for us. The idea that anxiety is sinful is not true biblically, but it can be. So you can either be prayerlessness or in Matthew 6, which is the chief passage. I'll close with this. When Jesus says this, so don't worry, right? Because anxiety is a division of worry, right? It's a lot of worry, fear, worry, a couple things mixed in. He says, do not worry about what we will eat or what we will drink or what we will wear, for the Gentiles eagerly seek all these, and your heavenly Father knows you need them. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has its own trouble, right? So really what Jesus is saying is, look, live in the moment right now. The Lord, the Father knows what you need before you even ask him. Don't worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow you got to deal with today. Just live in today and honor the Lord today and trust the Lord today. Don't worry about these things, right? Don't worry about them. So anxiety can be sinful when you, one, attack other people for it, like Yodi and Syntyche, right? Which I think anxiety can happen a lot. I think anxiety is not always personal, but it affects people personally. All right. Let me explain what I mean. It isn't personal, but it affects people. So people who struggle with anxiety, right? And then you live with someone who doesn't. Like I don't struggle with anxiety the way like my wife does per se, right? So her anxiety, sometimes I feel that. I can take it personal. It feels like a personal attack against me, but it's really not. It's something that she's dealing with and wrestling with. This is a whole topic in and of itself. I'm just kind of adding this on for a second because I am planning on coming back and talking about this one as a bigger deal. But anxiety often it feels like a personal attack to me, but to the person, it's not personal to them. Like they're not personally trying to attack me, but it feels personal to me. And that's where anxiety sometimes can become a problem, because when you struggle with it, if you don't realize that your anxiety causes distress to the other people, you're worried, you're complaining, you start to get angry, you want people to fix stuff, because when you're anxious, you want people to do things so that you feel less anxious, right? But that's not always possible. Sometimes you can't change the surroundings, you can only change you. So anxiety can be sinful, but it's not always sin. Can be sinful, but it's not always sin. Anxiety isn't personal, but it does affect people personally. And then lastly, I would say this. I think anxiety isn't always a choice. It's not always a choice. Sometimes it is. Anxiety isn't always a choice, but what you do when you're anxious is a choice. So anxiety, I talk to people as a pastor who struggle with severe anxiety, and none of them, it feels like I caught COVID, like something, it just happened to me. Now, we could say, well, it's a choice because you've sown to habits and patterns of thinking and acting a certain way, and now here's the sort of almost involuntary impact of your decision making is that you're anxious when something doesn't go your way or you're afraid of suffering. But again, anxiety is a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum. There's loving concern. There's stuff, but it's not always sinful, right? God's perspective is, look, I know that you don't know all things and you're worried. So look, trust me. Put your hope in me. Cast your anxieties on me, right? Give me prayer and supplication. But it's not really, you're going to hell because you're anxious. The wrath of God is coming because of these things. It's not always a choice. Sometimes people just feel this involuntary fear or worry about a circumstance. It's not always a choice, but there are times it is a choice. But what you do when anxious is a choice. So when you're anxious, do you cast those anxieties on the Lord? Do you, and I don't mean like in a 5-minute prayer and then like poof, it's gone. There may be times where the Lord is going to allow a season of struggle and you're going to respond to anxiety so that you learned how to cast your anxiety, or as Paul said in Philippians 4, with prayer and supplication. No, it's the same thing, right? Or like Jesus in the garden, he was praying. For me, here's where God probably didn't allow me to struggle with anxiety a lot, is because I'm just stubborn. I'll sit around and think my way through it. I want to think about the anxiety in different angles. And sometimes it's like, man, Kurt, shut up and pray, fam. Just shut up and pray, bro. You talk too much. You think too much. Pray more. Sometimes the Lord is just like, look, I don't need you to think your way through it. I don't need you. I just want you to pray. Cast your anxieties on me because I care for you. Because some of our anxiety is that we don't think the Lord really loves us. And we judge that by the circumstances that we go through. So like Jesus, we're like, man, we're suffering. I don't want this suffering. Take this suffering away from me. And the Lord is like, nah, it's this suffering. The suffering that I'm allowing to happen is what's changing you and making you more like me. It just wouldn't be our decision. So anyway, I'm rambling and I got to pick up my son. What do I know? This is just some thoughts from a dude who talks to people about anxiety all the time. And often I'm trying to help people realize, hey, fam, it's tough. It's tough, but take it easy on yourself. I think there's clear biblical, and you can disagree with me. That's fine. We're in the age of I disagree with you. I don't always agree with what you think. Thank you for telling me that. You don't always agree with what God thinks. You don't always agree with what your wife or your children or your animals, your pets think, right? So I don't really care about that. But the reality is anxiety isn't always sinful, but it can be. And Jesus had a moment of anxiety. And the Father, he always did what pleases the Father. So I'm not saying we should be anxious. I'm just saying when we're anxious, it doesn't mean we're displeasing the Father. But the question is, what do we do with that anxiety? Do we complain? Do we get angry at others because they're not anxious? Do we, sit around and think and can't sleep and won't? If our anxiety does not lead us to the Lord, then it's leading us to trust ourselves or someone else. That's when it can become sinful. Our anxiety should lead us to the Lord. And again, it sounds simple. If you struggle with chronic anxiety or severe anxiety, well, I pray all the time, it doesn't go away. This is the last thing I'm going to say. I told someone recently this. Listen, anxiety is a cross that many people have to carry. It's not a sin issue that everyone needs to repent of. Some do, yes. But anxiety is often going to be a cross that people have to carry. And I think we need Simon of Cyrenes, right? Not Caiaphas, the high priest of the Sanhedrin. We're too Caiaphas towards people that struggle with anxiety. Believers, we need more Simon of Cyrenes. Let me help you carry that cross. Even Jesus had someone help him carry the cross. Anxiety is a cross for many of our brothers and sisters. You can disagree. Show me from the scriptures where I'm wrong. Look in the Greek, though. I don't want to hear how you feel or what you were taught by some other teacher. I don't care. I don't know him. I don't pay tithes at his church. I can look at the scriptures and tell you why I think that. So you can disagree, but show me from the scriptures. If not, then encourage people. And if you do struggle with anxiety, it may just be an encouragement to you. Jesus had some anxiety too. But what did he do with it? That's what you have to ask yourself. All right? Thanks for watching. I got to go pick up my son, and we're going to get our Christmas tree. No cross-examine tonight. I apologize. We got some other stuff going on, but we will be back next week with a banger. All right? See you guys. Appreciate you. Like and subscribe to the channel. Trying to get over 2,000. Come on, fam. I got to get that fixed too. I know.